Chapter 4: A Colonial History. Defining Moments. There were some key defining moments in Canada's history that have had a deep and lasting impact on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada. These include the Indian Act, residential schools, the 1885 Métis resistance, forced Inuit relocations, the 60s Scoop, the White Paper of 1969, the Oka Crisis, the creation of Nunavut. Indian Act. Indians were mentioned in the British North America Act of 1867 and other policies. These came together in the Indian Act of 1876. To get some perspective on attitudes of that time, here is an excerpt from a letter that was sent by Indian Affairs to an Indian agent. I have therefore to direct you to use your utmost endeavors to dissuade the Indians from excessive indulgence in the practice of dancing. You should suppress any dance which cause waste of time, interfere with the occupations of the Indians, unsettle them for serious work, injure their health, or encourage them in sloth and idleness. You should also dissuade and, if possible, prevent them from leaving their reserves for the purpose of attending fairs, exhibitions, etc., when their absence would result in their own farming and other interests being neglected. The Indian Act is a government statute that still defines how Indians on reserve are to live and governs nearly all aspects of life. The Act made Indians wards of the state, gave the government the power and legislative authority to start an assimilation process, and defined who is an Indian or who is not. The Act created the reserves and chief and council system. The Act denied women status if they married a non-Indian. This was overturned with Bill C-31 in 1985. Many provisions were restrictive, with requirements for day passes, banning of potlatches and other ceremonies, no voting rights until 1960, and even restrictions to hire lawyers to negotiate land claims. People went to jail for dancing, giving gifts, protesting, and the list goes on. The Indian Act still affects people's lives today. The Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Carolyn Bennett, in 2016, has said the government is adamant about moving beyond the Indian Act. Métis resistance. Former history books called this the Riel Rebellion, more commonly known as the Riel Resistance. The Red River Colony, now downtown Winnipeg, was administered by the Hudson Bay Company and populated by Métis. Their rights to land were not respected. A group of Métis seized Upper Fort Garry, the main trading post, in 1870. They mounted a resistance and declared a provisional government to negotiate terms and enter Confederation. This led to the creation of the province of Manitoba and the emergence of Louis Riel as a leader. Note that in 1870, Rupert's Land was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. It was sold to the new Canadian government, and they subsequently negotiated all the numbered treaties based on that land purchase. Many people moved farther west, joining other Métis in Saskatchewan. They still didn't have formal title to their land, despite many petitions to the government. They desperately wanted to preserve their culture, language, religion, and land. Armed resistance ensued at Duck Lake in 1885. The government called this the Northwest Rebellion. The Métis were defeated at the Battle of Batoche later that year. Louis Riel was tried for treason by an all-white Protestant jury and hanged. The Métis see Louis Riel as a hero and father of Confederation. Several MPs have tried to pass bills to rescind the treason conviction and have him instated as a father of Confederation. Others still see him as a villain who caused the death of many people. The debate continues. Residential schools. The purpose of residential schools, as espoused by the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, was to kill the Indian and save the child. Residential schools first opened in the 1870s. There were 139 such schools across Canada. They were mandatory and were run by the government and churches. Stories of neglect, abuse, loss of language, culture, self-confidence, self-respect, parenting, and life skills abound to this day. Residential schools operated for more than 100 years. The last one closed down in 1996. Children were often far from home. and some had no means to go home for the holidays. These schools were a major part of an aggressive assimilation program. The idea was to reach the children, take away their culture and language, and replace them with English and French mainstream values. Some chiefs and Indigenous leaders thought it could be useful to learn the white man's ways, but many saw the horrible conditions in many schools and tried to keep their children away. Some were jailed for trying to do so. This Canadian Heritage Minute is about one child named Cheney Wenjack.
Johnny wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away. They forced him to go to the Indian residential school. More than 150,000 of us children had to go. They wanted to change us.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Hallowed be your name.
Thy kingdom come,
Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done.
thy will be done.
Kill the Indian and the child. It's been called cultural genocide. I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
Cheney Wenjack was one of thousands of children who died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy today.
Gord Downie from the band The Tragically Hip also told Cheney's story through a graphic novel and video called The Secret Path. There is now the Gord Downie and Cheney Wenjack Fund to focus on cross-cultural education and support, healing and recovery. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission put out 94 calls to action for all Canadians about how to address this legacy of residential schools. High Arctic relocation. In 1953, 87 Inuit families were forced to move from northern Quebec to the high Arctic. Moved far north to a completely different climate and ecosystem, with months of darkness, there was much hardship, even starvation. The reason for sending them there is a source of controversy. Was it a humanitarian gesture or Cold War assertion of sovereignty? If it was humanitarian, then the government ultimately abandoned these families to a worse life than the one that they had previously. In 1989, 40 Inuit returned to their original communities. In 1996, the government created a trust fund for relocated individuals, but issued no apology. Here's what one woman had to say about her experience. Indigenous activism. It's 1969. Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister. Jean Chrétien was Minister of Indian Affairs. Chrétien said, "Let's get rid of the Indian Act, make sure Indians have the same rights as all other Canadians, get rid of Indian status, transfer responsibility of Indian affairs to the provinces, and convert reserves to private land." It amounted to basically reneging on the treaties. Those ideas were laid out in what became known as the White Paper. Let's listen to one of these young Indigenous leaders had to say about this White Paper. Note, there is a lot of strong language here.
The policy paper is probably one of the most clever pieces of documentation that I've ever seen politically. It's aimed at the white people who are bigoted, who hate Indians. They'll be able to turn around and say, "Oh, those damn Indians will stop getting everything for nothing now." And it's aimed, I think, and here is where it's more dangerous, at the small L white liberal Canadians. Because there's this phraseology of freedom and equality that gets thrown in, and it's pretty difficult for a person to, especially a white person, to argue against this type of thing, because this places him in a position of being a reverse racist type of thing. I think the phraseology of equality and the phraseology of freedom is used much like the Nazis used the music of Beethoven as they were marching the Jews into the gas chambers. The documentation here that was presented to the House of Commons is one that accomplishes what the government could not accomplish legally. If they had a legal way and a way in which they could justify their action, I think they would have shot every Indian to death in this country this year. But since they could not do this morally, they resorted to a legal means of cultural genocide.
There was such an uprising after the introduction of this white paper that it led to the creation of the National Indian Brotherhood, which later became the Assembly of First Nations. Around this time, we also saw the creation of the Inuit Tapiriset of Canada, now called Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, the Council for Yukon Indians, now called Council for Yukon First Nations, and other groups to have a voice on the national stage regarding Indigenous issues. Everett Soup was a well-known Indigenous cartoonist, and he summed up the sentiment at the time, that if the government didn't want to acknowledge treaties, then they would take back the land. The 60s Scoop, also called the Stolen Generation. This is when many First Nation children were taken from reserves and placed in foster care, mostly in non-Aboriginal homes. The result was a continued loss of culture and language, plus broken links to communities, home, and family ties. In 1955, less than 1% of children in care in BC were First Nation. This jumped to 34% 10 years later. By 1970, this was as high as 70% in some provinces. New legislation starting in the 1980s was designed to ensure that children were placed with extended family or other First Nations families, if possible. But, unfortunately, we now have more First Nations children in care than we did during the 60s Scoop. For example, it is estimated that one First Nation child every day in Manitoba is being put into the foster care system. Oka, the Oka Crisis, the summer of 1990 in Quebec. It was about much more than just the expansion of a golf course. Here is the history and timeline on this event. 1717. The governor of New France gives land to a Roman Catholic seminary. Mohawks protested, asserting that some land was theirs. 1869. After writing a letter and repeated attempts to get the land back, a group of Mohawks attacked the seminary. They were held back by local authorities. 1936. The seminary sold its land for development. The Mohawks protested once again. 1961. The city of Oka built a private 9-hole golf course on a portion of the land. Mohawks protested yet again. 1977. The Mohawks filed a land claim. It was accepted for filing and was rejected 9 years later for failing to meet key legal criteria. The Mohawks protested. 1989. The mayor of Oka announces the remainder of the land would be cleared to expand the golf course and build luxury condos. No consultation, no historical preservation, or environmental review was undertaken. The Mohawks protested, and that's where the news stories came from. Nunavut. One of the most significant moments in Canadian history was the creation of the territory of Nunavut. This split the Northwest Territories into the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. It is the largest land claim agreement in Canadian history and took effect on April 1, 1999. It is a unique structure. While it is a public government, it is informed by Inuit language, culture, and ways of understanding, with a goal of increasing Inuit employment in all departments.